All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? As I said, I'm Christine Hooks, Chair of Friends of Hollin HIlls. We are very pleased today to have our neighbor and renowned landscape architect, Dennis Carmichael, back for another presentation, this time on native shrubs for the Hollin HIlls landscape. To give you a little bit of an introduction to Dennis. Dennis Carmichael, FASLA and lead AP, is a licensed landscape architect with 45 years of experience, spending most of his career with EDAW in Alexandria. His work has served as a catalyst for the revitalization of many American cities, including Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, Wharf District Park in Boston, and the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville. Locally, he designed the landscape for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, John Carlyle Square, Potomac Yard Park, Sally Mae, and Discovery Channel headquarters. He is currently leading the design of a 1 mile long deck park over the Interstate Highway in Midtown Atlanta. Dennis has received over 40 design awards, and his work has been published in such magazines as Landscape Architecture, Urban Land, and Architecture. He's served as national president of the American Society of Landscape Architects and also the Landscape Architecture Foundation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Christine. I assume everyone can hear me. I would have no way of knowing if that were not true. Today we're going to be talking about native shrubs. If you were in attendance a few weeks ago, we talked about native trees. This builds upon that. And as you can see from the attribution on the cover of this presentation, all the background information is derived from the Missouri Botanical Garden website. And I'll be talking a lot about that during this presentation. For me, it is the best site for technical information about plants, primarily because it's science-based and they're not trying to sell you anything. So it's all about just the knowledge. And I'm going to be sharing lots of the pages from there. What I'll also tell you is the only thing that I find defective, if you will, about their website is their photographs are very detailed and don't give you any sense at all of what the character is of the tree or shrub. So I have supplanted that with other photographs taken from other sources. So what you have here is kind of a unique resource of the technical acumen of the Missouri Botanical Garden information, plus a photograph that gives you a portrait of the essential character of each plant. In this case, all native shrubs. So we're going to start with definitions. And what I would say is if you were at the one a couple weeks ago on native trees, this will be slightly redundant. So this is a good time to go pour yourself a glass of wine so you can get through this next half an hour of native plants. So the first thing is, what is a native plant? Well, it's a plant, and these are definitions derived from the federal government. It is a plant that is naturally occurring either today or even historically, because sometimes they've been made extinct in the U.S. And what is an indigenous plant? Indigenous plant is one that is naturally occurring within a given ecoregion. So since we are in the Piedmont ecoregion, Mid-Atlantic Piedmont ecoregion, that is a more specific subset. So if you are a purist and you're interested in plants that really belong to this area, then what you're in search of are indigenous plants and not just native. So the opposite of that is exotic or alien. These are plants that have been brought in from other places, mostly Asia, and Europe. And what that means is they're not naturally occurring, but they've been introduced to the US. Then of that flavor, there's really two kinds. One is the naturalized plant, and that is a plant that has been introduced into the US, but is fairly benign. It has acclimated itself. It has not become aggressive or invasive. It has not harmed the ecosystem, but it is very comfortable. So an example of that is azaleas. Most azaleas are from China. And yet there's 1,000 azaleas in Hollin Hills, and they aren't overrunning everything, and people love them, and they do just fine. The same would be said for Japanese cherry trees. We love Japanese cherry trees. They are not natives, but they also are not destructive of the ecosystem in which they have been introduced in the US. Now, an invasive plant is a plant that has escaped into our ecosystem and does spread aggressively and does crowd out other plants and does hamper biodiversity. So that is a bad thing. And that causes environmental harm. And ultimately, it boils down to economic harm. And there probably is not a single Hollin Hills house that does not have at least one invasive, and we all know what they are. It's ivy, it's honeysuckle, it's bamboo, it's wisteria. There's lots of them. They're kind of everywhere, and so we battle them as we should. And the reason is, and we know this because we are all always trying to keep the ivy off our trees, is the ivy can literally kill the trees. So that's why we are constantly in a battle over invasive plants. So why should you plant native plants? Well, essentially, native plants are acclimated to this ecoregion, so therefore they need less water and less fertilizers. They are comfortable here. So you don't need to have an undue amount of energy or input to make them survive and thrive. What that actually means to you over the life cycle of your yard and your garden is it's going to cost you less money, because you don't have to water as much, you don't have to fertilize it as much. Once things get established, then they do fine. Now, having said that, if you plant a native plant, it doesn't mean that you don't need to water it. You definitely need to water it until it is established. But the benefit of a native plant is they are acclimated to the drought conditions that we sometimes get in the summer, to the heavy rains we sometimes get in the spring, and they do just fine. This is their region, so they thrive here. Native plants are also well suited for the heavy clay soils, and we all know that Hollin Hills is blessed with heavy clay soils, so the natives are used to it. This is their neighborhood, so they're fine, and that's another reason why to think about native plants. And if you've been planting exotics and you find that they are dying all the time, well, that might be one of the reasons. Our soil is really not good soil for growing any and every kind of plant. Native plants also provide habitat for insects and animals, and that adds to biodiversity and adds to the cycle of life. So that is a good thing. So native plants do not spread aggressively, but they do have a tendency to colonize. So it doesn't mean if you plant a native plant, it will just stay there, but they do colonize. And you see that in the woods. When you see mountain laurel, you see 30 mountain laurels. You don't just see one. When you see rose mallow in a wetland, you see 30 of them, not just one. So colonizing is different from being invasive, because colonizing really suggests that they adapt to the soil and water regime and they spread within that, but they don't just go everywhere, and they don't have a tendency to crowd out other things. Native plants can also provide food and medicines. That's another benefit. And they also serve as pollinators. And again, that's a subset of the biodiversity benefit. So for all these reasons, you should consider native plants in your garden. Does that mean that you are a bad person if you plant azaleas? No, but it's good to know another way of thinking about setting up your garden and your yard to have an ecological basis to it, and not just a cosmetic basis to it. So now we're going to go through a series of these pages that are taken from Missouri Botanical Garden. And I guess the first question I would ask is, I'm seeing on my screen my face and a column of faces, which is obscuring some of the information. Are you all seeing that it's obscuring it, or are you seeing it in full screen?
We're seeing your full screen. Okay,
good. So I'm not going to worry about that. Okay, so the first thing you see, again, on the right-hand column is the actual listing from the Botanic Garden website. And the first one we're going to talk about is black chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa. And you say, what is that word? The the Latin name or scientific name is how scientists refer to all plants. And the reason that they do that is because that's a universal name anywhere in the world. So an aronia is an aronia, whether it's here or South America or China or wherever. And that gives it constancy. What happens is that even in the US, there are multiple common names for plants. So if you want to really get the plant that you're in search of, the scientific name is the way to go. So does that mean you have to learn Latin? No, because if you use their website, you can, in their search tool, you can type in the common name and it will take you to this page. So don't be intimidated by the Latin phrasing, but just know that it's science-based for the specificity of it. So let's just go down the column here and I'll just share with you quickly what this website tells you. It tells you the type. In this case, it's a deciduous shrub, the family, the native range, the zone, 3 to 8. And planting zones are important to know because they map the ecoregions across the US. So the lower the number, the higher the latitude in the US. So for example, zone 3 is northern New York and Minnesota and the northern edges of the US. Zone 8 is Florida, southern Georgia, Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. We are in zone 6.5. And I say that because when I started my career, we were zone 6. And now we're a little bit different. When I started my career, you could plant sugar maples and Canadian hemlocks, and now you can't. Now we're planting southern magnolias and crepe myrtles. So I predict that in another 40 years, we will be zone 7. And that means we'll have live oaks and maybe a palm tree here or there, just like they do in Norfolk. So climate change is real. It's really happening. But what I can tell you is that all the plants that I have in this list, in this compendium, and this will be available on the website, are acclimated to our zone. So I pre-selected, I've curated these for that purpose. So just if you pick any of these plants, you know they're going to work in Hollin HIlls. Then it tells you the bloom time, the bloom description. A critical one here for plant selection is sun. Full sun to part shade for aronia, but you need to read that very carefully as you're thinking about any particular plants. And you also need to study your yard. Where is it sunny? Where is it shady? Because if you put a plant that is a shade lover in full sun, it's going to fry and it's going to die. And you're going to wonder why. If you put a plant that you see in the catalog says these beautiful blooms and you put it in deep shade, you're going to wonder why you don't get the beautiful blooms. Well, maybe it needs full sun. So it's quite important that you understand where the sun is relative to your yard and that you understand the characteristics required by any of these shrubs. And again, this Missouri Botanical Garden site is so good because it tells you all the information you need to know on one page. It tells you how much water means how much water it needs. So it's either high or low or medium, maintenance, low, medium, high. Suggested uses, which is good. It's sort of giving you a clue of how you might think about it in the landscape. It tells you if the flower is showy or not showy. Leaf, if it has good fall color, and again, that's one of the major attributes of aronia. It has stunning red color. It's beautiful. It also tells you that it attracts birds, and it describes the fruit. So again, this is a quick compendium of our first species here. And then I've put a fall portrait showing what it looks like in full, as it's fully grown. Our next one is Beautyberry. And this one is mostly known for this incredibly beautiful, delicate fruit, which is magenta colored, kind of contrasted with the very light green leaves. It's really a beautiful plant. It's very underused, and it's a wonderful plant to put sort of in, I would say, the middle to back of the garden, because it does want to grow maybe up to 6 feet. You want to give it room to do that. It'll start off small, but you want it to get to about the size that you see in the photograph here on the left, where it really creates an edge and creates a form. And you can imagine planting things in front of it, and you could have trees behind it. It's one of those I would call middle row kind of shrubs, where It's too big to put right in the front row because it will crowd everything out, but it's wonderful as a backdrop. And again, because of its fabulous colored berries that really sing in the fall. Next one is Carolina Allspice, Calicanthus. And this one is a more delicate kind of plant. It's the photograph that you see here on the left-hand side is probably a more perfect version of it as you see it grown in a garden. It's a little bit leggier, a little bit more what I would call maybe picturesque. It doesn't grow as full and as dense as what this shows, but it does want to get big. You can see the height is 6 to 10 feet. It's a springtime flower, and it has a very dark crimson color. So that's one of its unique attributes. It has a the flower is darker than the vegetation. And quite often it's just the opposite with most plants, where the flower is lighter than the leaf. So this is one that is great in a naturalized kind of garden. You might not want to put this right next to your front door, but in the background, it creates a sense of richness and depth because of that contrast, that unique contrast of a dark flower on a light green or medium green leaf. And then look at the last category they introduced on this one is tolerate. This is my favorite category. This is the first thing that I look for whenever I'm looking at plants. And in this case, it says it tolerates deer, clay soil, wet soil. Yeah, that's Hollin HIlls. Yep, we got that. So that's again, as you're considering plant selections and it says tolerate, just zoom right down there. And if it says it does not tolerate clay soil, then you have some issues if you want to try to plant it within Hollin HIlls. Doesn't mean you can't, but what it does mean is you would have to raise the beds or amend the soil. You couldn't just plunk it in the ground and hope for the best, because you're going to be very disappointed. So I put this in here for that particular reason. It's one of the ones that if you have one of those corners of your yard where the lawn doesn't grow and nothing's growing and everything I tried dies, it's probably because the soil's too wet, and this might be a good plant for you. Clethra alnifolia, you might know it as sweet spire or sweet pepperbush. It's also just called clethra. Again, there's lots of names for these things. This is one of my favorite shrubs because it's so multi-use. It can take very wet soils, but it also is drought tolerant. It's kind of crazy. But you mostly think about it as a wet site kind of a plant, but you also see it near the beach. You don't see it on the beach itself. You see it in the back bay dunes and the back bay sort of wetland areas as you approach a beach. That's where I first learned this plant, in fact. It has an incredibly fragrant flower. It's as sweet as honeysuckle smelling, as sweet as cherry laurel, and it blooms in early summer. So it blooms at a different time. That's another attribute of it. After all the azaleas are done, after all the spring flowering things, all of a sudden, here comes clethra. And in some cases, it stays out for a month or two. So it's a good one for giving your garden a little bit of color at a time where there's not much else blooming in July and August. I have used it in a rain garden and it thrives. It is wonderful. It's quite happy in that kind of use. And again, if you look at that, if you fast forward down to tolerate, heavy shade, erosion, clay soil, wet soil, yep, that's Hollin HIlls. We got that. So again, that's one that you should consider. Cornuceracia, they call it red twig dogwood. I know it as red osier dogwood. This is a plant that actually looks best in winter. That seems impossible, and it's deciduous. The portrait on the left-hand side shows it's a sort of a normal average shrub, anywhere from 3 to 6 feet high. It has, okay flowers, nothing too special, okay leaves, nothing too special. But the twigs turn a brilliant bright red in the wintertime. And when there's snow on the ground and everything is gray and forlorn, red osier dogwood is the star of the show. It is a wonderful sort of profile against a winter scene of brown and white. just a beautiful, beautiful twig structure. But again, it is deciduous, so it's not, the leaves go away, and it's just the branches and the twigs that create that seasonal interest. Fataguilla is one that's a little bit undersung. You don't see it all that frequently. It is seen as more of I would call a naturalized garden plant, because it doesn't, how do I say this? It doesn't have a pure form. It doesn't shape itself beautifully or elegantly. It's not the kind of tree, shrub that you would ever try to turn into a hedge or prune into a pure shape. It just wants to be free form. And because of that, it is a great background shrub. It wants to be tall, between 6 and 10 feet high. It has these beautiful, delicate, candle-like flowers, which bloom within the normal springtime regime. But you can see it's even in this portrait, I tried to capture the attribute that I'm trying to say. It's very asymmetrical. It doesn't want to end up being a pure form, nor should you let it. Just let it be naturalized, and think of it as a background plant in your garden. This one does not like wet feet. This one is a dry site plant. The plant known as rose mallow, and this is probably how you know this plant because you've seen it in Dyke Marsh and Little Hunting Creek. You see it around the edges of the Potomac River. Is actually not a rose at all. It is a hibiscus. And it is beautiful because of two things. One, it is the tallest of the plants that you see in these wetland areas and these brackish marshes, and it has the most profuse flowering that's visible. There's lots of flowering plants in the marsh, but rose mallow is the one that's most visually dominant because the flowers are at the top of the stalks, and the stalks can be as high as 6 to 7 feet. So they're just magnificent. And you see them, again, they have a tendency to colonize. And when you see them, you don't just see one, you see, 30. Sometimes you might even see 100, but they're not as aggressive as, let's say, iris or cattail. But when you see them, you usually see more than one because they do spread by runners. They can actually be in standing water. You see them in along the shoreline of Little Hunting Creek, where it's routinely and intermittently inundated with water. It might not be standing water 100% of the time, but it's more wet than not wet. And so that's the kind of plant that it is. So all that means is if you wanted to plant it in Hollin Hills, you would have to make sure it was kept constantly wet, and probably in one of those low spots in your yard where it's happy having all the runoff go down to it. It's a great rain garden plant, but otherwise it won't perform in an upland area of your yard or a dry area. It really wants to have wet soil. I don't know about its tolerance for clay soil because I've never planted it in a heavy clay regime. So my guess is its native habitat is not necessarily heavy clay. It's probably more of a silty kind of a habitat. So if you wanted to plant it, you would probably need to amend soil and not, again, just simply throw it in that hole in the ground in the wet corner of your yard. Oakleaf Hydrangea, probably everyone knows this. This is one of the natives that you can get even at Home Depot. It's everywhere, and rightfully so. It is beautiful. Again, the leaves kind of look like an oak leaf. That's where it gets that moniker. Beautiful flowers, and the flowers it's a summertime flower. Again, it wants to be informal, asymmetrical. It doesn't want to be trimmed. You want to just sort of let it go. And it will reward you with that. It's a very billowing kind of plant. It will get up to 6 feet high and just sort of go wherever it wants to go. It will take pretty deep shade, but it'll flower better in the sun. So again, that's really true of any hydrangea, that they're happier, or they will bloom better in the sun, but they are quite happy in the shade. So for those of you that have shady parts of your garden, this is a wonderful choice. And the flowers can be quite profuse. So this could be a plant in a courtyard or right near your patio or a deck, right nearby, not necessarily in the background, but it could be in the foreground. Ilex verticillata is Winterberry is the common name. This is another one that actually has its best appearance in the dead of winter. And the portrait that I show here is how it looks in the summertime. And it's just a wonderful green foliage plant, and it's very dense foliage, very strong branching pattern. But it is deciduous. It does drop the leaves. It's a holly, but it's deciduous. So if you buy one, don't be scared. Don't think it's dying because all the leaves drop off, unlike most deciduous hollies. But what it leaves behind in the dead of winter are these wonderful, brilliant cardinal red berries, which are just beautiful. And that's the striking attribute. So again, just like red osier dogwood, it looks wonderful against the snow and against the gray, bleak, and brown days of December and January and February. Virginia sweet spire is a wonderful Virginia native. You can see that it has these candle-like flowers that are very delicate, very profuse, a wonderful foliage plant, and a long bloom time, June to July. And I've seen it bloom earlier than that. I've seen, like we're starting right now, you can begin to see it bloom all the way into July. It does like the shade. When I've used it in full sun, I have not been happy. I have seen it just fry, even though this says, full sun to part shade. In my experience, no, it really wants to have shade. Now, the question would be how deep shade, and the variable would be if it's really deep shade, you might not get the abundant flowering that you get in a partial shade, but you would still get a very good workhorse kind of a plant. It's a good front row plant. It doesn't get that high. You can see 3 to 5 feet. I think of it as more closer to 3. It doesn't get that tall. And you can see suggested use, rain garden. Yeah, that is a definite use for it. It likes to have wet feet and it's quite happy. And again, if you see the tolerate, heavy shade, erosion, clay, yeah, that's Hollin Hills. So this is one that you should put on your list. Spicebush is, I always think of these two almost in the same sentence because you see them quite often together in the woods. They are in the same general area, but Spicebush is a little bit more, I'd call it a feathery kind of a texture. It does not have a showy flower. It's more of a vegetation plant, but it is also a rain garden plant. And as you can see, it tolerates deer and drought and heavy shade and clay. So it's a really good understory plant. You see it in the woods as along the path, underneath the deep and heavy canopy of the trees. So in your yard, you would use it in the same way. It would be a plant that you could put in the background, naturalized underneath shade trees, and it would be quite happy. It does have a wonderful red color in the winter, in the fall. That's another attribute. Nine bark is one that has a very dark, the reason I put this in here, it's one that doesn't get used all that often, but it has this really dark vegetation and brilliant, light, delicate, almost pointillist flowers, really, really delicate. And when I have seen it myself, it does not flower as profusely as the photograph that I picked on the left, but that was probably because it was in the shade. I think it more of a detail plant and a texture plant. It says it gets 5 to 8 feet. I've never seen it over 4 feet, but maybe that's just because I've never seen them over 4 feet. So I think of it as a plant that you can put on the front row or in the middle row in your yard. It does not need to be a background plant. You can put it right up front because it is such a detailed and delicate flower and leaf. And again, it has all the no-nos of Hollin Hills: drought, erosion, clay soil, dry soil, shallow and rocky soil. One thing you will see here, it is not wet tolerant. So this is not a rain garden. This is one of your dry site ones. This is one of your high point or higher side of your yard, not the low point, because this will not take the heavy wet clays. Flame azalea. This is the native azalea you see when you're hiking in the Blue Ridge. and it's characteristic by the orange flower. And again, it's a more, I tried to depict the portrait here that shows it's a very irregular kind of asymmetrical plant. It's unlike the azaleas that you get at Home Depot, which are perfect and grow perfectly. It's the native azalea. So it is going to be more sculptural, if you will, more dynamic in form, less formal, does not want to be clipped, does not want to be sheared into a more formal kind of form, the way many people shear azaleas. And that's part of its charm and part of its beauty. It does get tall. I've seen them, this says 4 to 8 feet. I've seen them 10 to 12 feet in the Blue Ridge if they're that many years old. And they become almost like small trees. So they have this beautiful, light, leggy kind of twig pattern. And quite often one of the magical experiences of seeing the flame azalea is you're underneath it looking up, which is not something you experience with azaleas that are the normal Chinese azaleas that you see in most people's gardens in Hollin Hills. That's why I like it. However, it's a very slow grower. And I'll also let you know that it's hard to find. If you go to most nurseries, they'll have 5,000 different azaleas. But if you ask them for the native azalea, they'll say, oh, no, we don't have that. So you got to work for this one, but it's worth it. Fragrant Sumac it's a first cousin of Staghorn Sumac, which you know as a tree, but this one stays low. And this one says height of 2 to 6 feet. And I've never seen it 6 feet high, but I think of it as 2 to 4 feet. So it's a very native, a very naturalized kind of edge plant. Does it say it hedges? Yeah, I would never try to hedge it because it doesn't want to do that. It just wants to grow into a mound. And that's really how it wants to fill space. And again, this is the opposite of wet tolerant. This is dry tolerant. This is the upland side. This likes the rocky soil or the shallow soil. If you put it in the low part of your yard, you're going to regret it because it just won't be happy. Swamp rose, this is a true rose. And again, some people confuse this with rose mallow, and not at all. This is actually a true rose, and it is a native rose. And again, when you go to the garden shop, you will see 5,000 roses that are cultivars that are not native at all. So you got to work to find the native ones if you want one of these. But it is beautiful, and it does have the characteristics that we know and love about roses. Oh yeah, I just wanted to go. Yeah, the reason I put this in here also is it tolerates wet soils. So this is a rose, unlike most roses, if you put them in a wet site, they're gonna die. They're gonna get that fungus and they're gonna die. This one is quite happy in a rain garden situation or in a wet soil condition. But again, like the flame azalea, you got to work to find this one because you're not going to find it in your typical garden center. Pussy willow, everyone knows what pussy willow is. You remember that from being a child. And the reason I put it in here is that it is a wet soil plant. And of course, because it's a willow, it does want to grow into a tree form height. It says 6 to 15 feet. And yeah, we've all seen them to be that high. In fact, I actually think of it as a small tree, not as a shrub. It wants to be a tree. You can see that you want to limit up and give it room to breathe and let the canopy, let the foliage be at the top so that you begin to see some of the twig structure. And of course, we all know about how beautiful the buds look. So that's part of its charm. But again, it is a good rain garden plant, and it does tolerate deer, which is something that we have to battle with all the time in Hollin Hills. Spirea, again, there's a million spireas. You see them all the time. To get a native one, you have to work a little bit at it, but they are equally as beautiful. Not as showy, I would say. The flowers are white. They're not those brilliant blues and pinks and everything that you can get in a spirea. But this spirea is also rain tolerant. Wet soil tolerant, so you can use it in a rain garden. So it has that going for it as well. High bush blueberry. This is one that maybe you have or maybe you haven't seen in the wild, but it's blueberries. I mean, it's the things that you eat in your yogurt, and there they are. So you can grow it, and it it does like well-drained soil. It does not like the heavy, wet soil, and it does need to have a lot of water. So this is one you got to kind of work at. If you put it in your yard, you have to agree that you're going to give it enough water so it's happy, but not so much water so it drowns. So this is one, again, that you have to work at, only because our soils are so disagreeable. Where you normally see it is in a more of a silty loam kind of condition, which we just don't have. So this is one where if you wanted to do it, you're kind of agreeing that you're going to give it some TLC above and beyond, because it's not normally happy in our very wet, heavy clay soils. Viburnum dentatum, Arrowwood. This is a wonderful, fast-growing shrub with these beautiful, delicate flowers that flower in what I would call late spring. They've already come and gone, and it has, I think its greatest attribute is it's fast-growing. So if you wanted to create the form or an edge to your yard, Viburnum is something you could consider. It is deciduous, so it will lose its leaves, but it has a really, really dense branching pattern. So in that sense, you can think of it almost as a screening shrub, even though it loses its leaves, and it does tolerate the clay soil. So it's a good choice for this neighborhood. Okay, now we're going to switch over to evergreen shrubs. All the ones that I've just gone through have been deciduous. Now we're going to go through evergreen. And one of the things you're going to notice is there just aren't that many, or aren't as many. And that's just the truth. So when you go to a garden center, they're normally steering you towards evergreens because that's what people like. And most of those are exotics. They're not natives, but there's plenty of natives to choose from. So you can still have your evergreen hedges, your evergreen screens, your backdrops, no worries. But it's a smaller palette maybe than you had thought of. So the first one it's called Inkberry, Ilex glabra, and it is a holly. And it's probably the one that you don't see a lot, because you see the Burford holly and the other hollies that have the prickly kind of leaves. This one has a soft, attenuated kind of leaf, but it is evergreen, and it is wet tolerant. Many hollies, in fact, are not wet tolerant, but this one is. So it's perfect for a rain garden. I've had terrific success in planting it. It's sort of the go-to plant for that serves purposes of wet sites and evergreen, and commercially available. You can get it anywhere. You could probably get it at Home Depot. I haven't looked, but it's the one plant that is both native and very, very commercially available. So for that sense, it's not difficult to find at all. And you can see in the category of tolerate, rabbits, deer, erosion, wet soil, Hollin HIlls. Here's the almost the opposite. This is a juniperus, and everybody knows junipers, and there's a zillion junipers. Many of them are not native, but the horizontalis is, and horizontalis is a good cue word for what it actually does. Is it creeps along the ground. It's really kind of a ground cover. And this is the opposite of the wet site tolerant one. This is your dry, rocky, upland, highland, well-drained parts of your yard that need full sun. It also is one of the most tolerant plants to abuse. It can take salt spray. You can back your car over it. It takes all sorts of abuse. It's the plant you see in parking lot islands, which is the worst condition for any plant on planet Earth. And juniperus is okay. So that's a key indicator. If you see it in a Costco parking lot, you know it's going to survive in Hollin HIlls. But again, needs to have full sun, needs to have well-drained soil. But many of us have those attributes in our yards. So if you have one of those conditions, this is a good plant for you. Now, I will say it's very abrasive, it's very prickly. So if you have little children and they have a tendency to want to run up against it, it's itchy and scratchy and not pleasant So just think about that. It's a very scabrous, almost abrasive kind of foliage. Call me a latifolia, mountain laurel. This should be everybody's favorite. It is wonderfully abundant in the mid-Atlantic. In fact, we were just at Fountainhead Park yesterday. They're in full bloom right now. If you haven't seen them, go. The other place that you could see them in their profuseness is Prince William Forest Park, and they're stunning. They grow up to be 20 feet tall there. They're amazing. And of course, they're probably 50 to 80 years old, but you can plant them in your yard. Now, however, this is one of those ones where it is commercially available, you can get it, but you're gonna need to work at it to have it survive in your yard. It does not like heavy, wet clay soil. And then you're gonna say, well, wait a minute, when I see it, it's along the stream. Well, it is, that's where you see it, but it doesn't stay wet. It gets inundated periodically, but it is in when you think about the conditions it's in a rocky, dry, sandy, silt kind of soil. It's not in the heavy clay. So what does that mean? If you wanted to have mountain laurel in your yard, you would have to amend the soil, and you'd have to create a raised bed. You can do that, and you'd have to give it dappled sunshine. It does quite well in deep shade, but it wants, again, like anything, if you want to get profuse blooms, it wants what I would call filtered sunlight. So that's kind of asking for a lot. Filtered sunlight, you got to amend the soil. It has to be raised up, good drainage, and keep it wet. Yeah, this is one of the ones where I would not call this a low maintenance shrub, but it pays off in the quality of the blooming, the beauty of it, the enduring quality, and it is evergreen. So it looks beautiful all year round. It looks exceptionally beautiful when it's in bloom. And again, by the way, it's in bloom right now. So go see it. Mahonia Aquifolium. This is one of those ones that's native but not indigenous. I learned this as Oregon grape holly, and this calls it holly-leafed barberry. But it is a native, and it's native to the Pacific Northwest, but it is naturalized to the East Coast and does just fine. It has a couple qualities that I find very endearing. It almost looks tropical. The foliage is very large, and it has this kind of languid, hanging kind of quality to it. It has these profuse berries. The fruit of it is this kind of iridescent blue color. They're out right now. They look beautiful right now. That said, the leaves are very prickly, and I mean very prickly. So you don't want to plant it anywhere near where kids are going to be running in or chasing a ball or anything like that, because it's just not comfortable. Miracle, Pennsylvania is bayberry, and yes, this is where you get your bay leaves from. So, and it's a wonderful plant. It is both native and indigenous to this area, and it's a wonderful plant. It's evergreen. It grows up to, what do they say, 5 to 10? Yeah, I would believe that. I've seen it typically around 6 feet high. You see it quite often associated with clethra on what I would call the back dunes or the backwaters near the beach. It likes full sun. It's saying it tolerates wet soil. I have not had great success in planting it in wet soil. I've had more success when the soil is, well, I'll say this, when it's well drained. Now it can get wet, but it has to dry out. So again, I would not say you could plant this directly into the heavy clay soil of Hollin Hills, but if you amended it, you planted it a little high, yes, it does take intermittent water. It just doesn't like to be in the standing water that happens as a consequence of the heavy clay soil when it doesn't percolate for like 3 days. But it's a great plant. You can see it's incredibly dense foliage, and you can shear it into a hedge. It mounds up. It's a great background plant. But again, it really wants full sun. Prunus caroliniana we know it as cherry laurel. This is a wonderful plant. It is a sort of creeping, almost horizontally creeping shrub that colonizes and will spread in your yard, but very slowly. It wants to be, what do they say, 15 to 20 feet high. I've never seen it that tall. I've seen it maybe 12 to 15 feet. So, but I think when it gets that high, in my observation, it starts going more horizontally than vertically. But it has these beautiful candle-like flowers in April that are incredibly fragrant. You can smell it, from 30 feet away. It's just a wonderful, wonderful plant. And it is evergreen. It creates a really dense, glossy leaved background. It's also a good front row plant because it wants to be horizontal, and you can shear it if you want to keep it low. Rhododendron, yeah, there are a few rhododendrons that are native, but again, most of them are actually from China. So you have to work a little bit. You'll go to the garden center and they'll say, oh yeah, there's our rhododendron area, and every single one will be from China. So you got to work a little bit to get the native ones, but the native ones share the same attributes: beautiful blooms in June and July, earlier here, really late May and into June. Beautiful drooping vegetation. Does want to get big, 15 feet. Yep, I've seen that. You see that all over the place. I would ask you to go down to the very last sentence in the thing called culture. All parts of this plant are highly toxic if ingested. And I learned this about 20 years ago, and I had no idea. So again, just a word to the wise. If you have young children, you might not want to plant it right near where they're playing. And is it something that is a real serious problem? I would say generally no. But when you see this written by a scientist, all parts of this plant are highly toxic, it's a wake-up call. So for example, since then I've never planted it in any place associated with children, like pools or playgrounds or any places, just on the off chance that some kid might think it's amusing to put a leaf in their mouth and chew it. So just, again, a word to the wise. But probably half the houses in Hollin Hills have rhododendrons, and now you know there's toxicity. Okay, and on that lovely note, we'll go to some sources. This is the last screen, because the first question you're going to ask is, well, where do I get these plants? And you can get some of them at the large commercial growers like Merrifield Garden Center. The closest one is in Falls Church. There's also ones that are out in Fairfax County. Meadows Farms, you probably know that place as well. The closest one is in Annandale. A place that you might not know is Patuxent Nursery in Bowie. It's probably as close as the other two. It's across the Wilson Bridge and on 301. They have lots of goodies there. So it's a little bit undersung. They serve more of the Prince George's County market than Virginia, but I have been there on several occasions and they have wonderful stuff. And then a couple of what I would call boutique places. One is called Green Streets in Alexandria. It is at the intersection of Braddock and Quaker, and what's the third one? Oh, King. Yeah, Braddock and Quaker and King. That funny intersection. It's right there. And they have, it's a big garden center. They have lots of stuff that's not native, but they do have lots of natives, and they do have smart people that work there. So if this is one of those places where you can dig deep and say, well, I don't want that one from China. Do you have a native? And they'll work with you to find it. And then this last one is called Nature by Design. And this is definitely a boutique place. It is, by all appearances, a family-run operation. It is 100% native. So this is one where if you really are a purist, or you really want to make sure that you get natives, this is one you might want to pay a visit to. Now, having said that, it's in the Delray neighborhood. It is off Route 1 near Potomac Yard. It's down a industrial road, and they're right at the dead end of it. And you say, where the heck is the nursery? Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, and their selection is great, but their sizes are very small. So anything you get there is going to be either a seedling or something that's going to take several years to grow. But they're very helpful, and everything there is native. So with that, we can open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for that lovely presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat function, and I'll go ahead and read them off to Dennis. I did have a question that came in over email, and I'm not sure whether it may have been covered by your presentation, but I thought I would put it out there anyway. There was a question if you could recommend a shrub that is fairly low to the ground and not overly dense in growth habit, but that is also good for a semi-shaded slope. I don't know if you would know that offhand, or if you can think of one that was in your presentation that would fit that description.
Well, yeah, it depends. I mean, it sounds like they're describing something between a ground cover and a shrub.
Right.
And there are certainly ground covers that fit that. I'd also need to know, is it sunny or shady?
I think it says shady.
Shady.
Yeah.
Yeah, then again, depending on how much they want to clip it, I would say the Rus aromatica, the creeping sumac would be a good choice. That would be fine. Even clethra, I think, would be okay. But clethra you would have to trim because it would want to grow to be 6 feet tall. But you could buy it as a plant. It would hold the erosion. It would take that sort of dappled shade kind of condition. And it might not flower as well as it would in full sun, but it will flower.
Great. We did get a question that I think pertained to the opening of your presentation on native plants. And I know we're sort of focusing on shrubs, but it seems like a quick question, so I'll throw it out there for you. Do you consider Virginia creeper as a colonizing plant or one that just spreads aggressively?
Boy, it depends. I would say it's colonizing.
Yeah, okay.
Because you can keep it in bounds more easily. It's all about, can you control it? So you can keep it in bounds more so than ivy, more so than kudzu, more so than honeysuckle, more so than wisteria. So yes, it does spread, but it is easier to manage.
And I mean, I'm assuming Virginia creeper is a native plant.
Yes. Yeah, it's a native vine. Yes. Yeah.
And then we had more of a comment from Paul Phelps on Winterberry, where he is, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. Winterberry is dioecious, requiring male and female plants to get berries. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. Paul was saying it's important to match blooming times so that the males and females are blooming at the same time.
Yeah. There are several plants, and this is one of them, where you don't want to just plant one. You have to plant several, and you have to say you want some male and some female, so that they do cross pollinate, and then you do get the berries. Otherwise, you might not get the berries.
I see. Yeah. Okay. But it does sound like, I mean, you would need them to be blooming at the same time, right? So you'd have to be careful about that, about which.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And honestly, you would have to make sure, again, that you're planting more than just one plant, but make sure that you're talking with the folks at the nursery to ensure that you're getting some male and some female.
Okay. And then let's see, here is another one. Could you please suggest a screening shrub for full shade and wet conditions? And I was going to ask this also. I'm assuming by screening shrub, he's hoping for an evergreen, because as I was going through, I'm also looking for that. And I think I only saw one that maybe fell into that category, but an evergreen that would be for full shade and wet conditions.
Yeah, inkberry comes to mind because the other qualifier is, can you find it, and can you get it in a large enough size that it actually does something? Because there's a lot of these shrubs that if you buy them as a seedling, you might have to wait 15 years before it's actually doing the job. And I realized that in most cases, when people want screening, they want it immediately. So in my practice, what I end up doing quite often is specifying evergreen trees and planting them reasonably close together and creating the screen with evergreen trees, and then just saying, well, by the way, you're going to have to prune these or trim them and have it grow into a hedge, and that's fine. It's really about managing, both managing your expectations, but also managing the plant.
Okay. So you can't, at least off, I mean, it's probably hard to do off the top of your head, but so you can't really come up with anything other than inkberry that would fall into this category.
Evergreen and wet. Yeah, it is. It is hard because most of the evergreens really do want to be dry. So they'll tell you that bayberry can tolerate wet conditions, but my experience has not been that.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have another question, and this might be a little bit of a review, but for those who weren't able to attend the presentation on trees, can you name a couple of that you just mentioned using evergreen trees that you could use for screening and be able to trim them down to more of a shrub size? Can you name a couple of those that you were thinking of as options for that?
Yeah, well, American holly is something you can trim. Arborvitae is something you can trim. Eastern red cedar is something that you can trim. It trims well. It forms a hedge in a way that looks beautiful and not like it's been hacked to pieces.
Right. Okay. Let's see. We have a kind of specific question asking if skip laurel is a native. We have someone who's having trouble with yellowing and dropping leaves and wondering.
Yeah, it's a cultivar of the cherry laurel, and it's the one you get in all the garden centers. So it's technically not native, but there's some native DNA in there. And if it's yellowing and dropping leaves, that probably means it's being overwatered.
Okay.
Or the soil is too wet.
Right, soil too wet, yeah.
Yeah, because cherry laurel doesn't really like wet soil. It likes, perfect soil, but it'll tolerate the wet soil if it's not at the lowest point. In other words, if it dries out.
Right. Okay. And then we have another tree question. Is a white pine a native tree?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And then a general question, can you define full sun versus part shade? Like in terms of, like, how would you describe that in your yard? What constitutes full sun versus part shade?
Yeah, I would say full sun means in the summer, 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, of, blazing full on sunlight. And that usually means south facing, because full sunlight doesn't really count from the eastern exposure. You hardly count it up until maybe 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. in the morning. Plus, in Hollin HIlls, we know that there's so much other canopy around that the sun doesn't really come over the canopy until about 11 o'clock anyhow. So yeah, full sun means 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. And then, shade is less than that.
But so part shade, is that then, I guess it's mostly sun. So would that be, so that would not be maybe a southern exposure, but, could you maybe directionally give us a thought as to what part shade might be?
Yeah, well, part shade could be several different things. It could mean the dappled filtered light of a high canopy tree that's 80 feet tall that still allows sunlight through it that reaches the ground, and you would call that filtered sunlight and not direct sunlight. And for many shrubs, that's pretty perfect stuff because they're getting sunlight, but they're not getting the crushing, 8 hours of blazing sunlight. You could also say, well, on the north side of the house is shading things. The house itself is shading things. So even though there's no canopy, let's say, it still could be considered a shady site if it's within the shadow of the house itself.
Okay. Then we have a question about rhododendrons. Why do all the rhododendrons I see in Hollin Hills seem to be so leggy and unhappy? I'm guessing that has to do with water, because I know that's what killed my rhododendron in my yard, but you probably have a more specific answer to that.
Well, yeah, and water is the short answer. And the heavy, wet clay soils in this neighborhood have a tendency to hold water, so it doesn't percolate, so it sits there. And rhododendrons are sensitive to that. However, I have rhododendrons in my yard that have been there for 30 years and they're doing okay, but they're not thriving.
Right.
Because of that. They have a stunted growth. So doesn't mean you can't plant rhododendrons, but what it means is you need to create a raised bed that gives enough room, and maybe even put a 6-inch layer of gravel or crushed stone underneath the plant. So not only raise it, but make sure the roots are not sitting in the clay soil, and never plant a rhododendron in the lowest part of your yard. It's just not a good recipe. So look for the highest part of your yard. Look for filtered sunlight. Again, not 6 to 8 hours of full sun, because it will fry. And then amended soil. And what I've done this on projects. What I tell people is, if you really want to cultivate plants that like mountain laurel and rhododendron that fundamentally don't want to be in heavy, wet clay soil, you can punch French drains through your plant beds, which are holes in the ground that you auger down to 4 to 6 feet, and you fill those with crushed stone. And it just gives the water up someplace to go. Because what you'll find is rhododendrons are quite happy here if they have well-drained soil.
Yeah, I know. I was very sad. I had a huge rhododendron in the front of my yard that had clearly been here for many, many years, and we just lost it this past year because our front yard has been just so inundated with water in the past couple of years. And I think a lot of people are having that issue right now. Just the water table has been very high the past couple of years, and it's sort of affecting things. And I think that you just answered the next question we had on the secret to success for rhododendrons. So,
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. One of the phrases that we use is, you take a $5 plant and you put it in a $50 hole.
Right.
And what that means is you need to spend money and take time and care on the soil that you put in. You can't just throw a plant into a clay hole in the ground. You have to add soil, you have to amend the soil, you have to provide the drainage, and then you'll meet with success.
Right. Great. Well, thank you for that advice. I think that takes us through just about all of our questions in the chat. Just so everyone knows, we will be posting a video of the presentation on our new YouTube channel. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do so and subscribe. And we will also be posting the Dennis's presentations, the PowerPoint presentations up on the website. We haven't done that quite yet, but we will also make those available, because obviously there's a lot of information contained in there, and I'm sure everyone would like to be able to go back at their leisure and look at the plants that they were that maybe interested them during your presentation. So I think that is it for all of the questions. So I think we can probably wrap it up. I'm pretty much right on time, just a little after 5 o'clock. So I want to thank Dennis for taking the time to provide us all with such really great information and a beautiful presentation. that, you know, he worked hard on to provide us with very good full pictures of all of these shrubs and trees in his previous presentation. And we appreciate the effort and his time, and you know, being able to draw upon his knowledge. You know, it's helpful to all of us in the neighborhood. So thank you to Dennis, and thank you all for you know, attending today on a, you know, beautiful Sunday afternoon. And you know, we will see you next time. So thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you.